Hi guys, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. And today we're going to be talking about education. I'm sure that's a great topic you are just dying for. So education is a very old system in a way because obviously people have always had to be educated to a certain extent or another. But as a separate institution, geared towards training people or teaching higher level skills, education really is a fairly recent phenomenon. In the past, only the very wealthy would be educated, would be taught how to read and write, and also in some cases, people who were in monasteries or religious institutions also, and these very often became the clerks and the scribes throughout the Middle Ages. It isn't until really the 19th century, that is the 1800s, that mass education, or the idea that large numbers of people need to be educated, became a popular phenomenon, you might say. Today, almost everybody throughout the world goes through some form of formal education, which is provided either by the state or by state licensed institutions, and of course includes providing basic knowledge and skills, reading and writing, arithmetic, as they say, but it also provides a lot of basic cultural norms and values. When we talk about schooling, we're talking about the specific process or formal process of instruction under the direction of specifically trained teachers. So in the world, there is still a large variety of different approaches to education. Not every country provides education up through 12th grade, whether because of financial factors or cultural factors. For example, in India, the economy is simply not very strong, and government education is not usually guaranteed through 12th grade for everybody. Many poor people rely on their children for income, so they may pull their children out of school. And there's one could say, a bias against girls particularly being educated, because that's seen as counterproductive to their role within the household. On the other hand, in Japan, you have one of the most highly educated countries in the world in terms of government-sponsored education up through 12th grade, and very high expectations put on students. So students take a very rigorous exam at the end of high school, and based on that, it's determined whether or not they go to college, which is also usually government-sponsored. But these exams are very difficult, and only about half of graduates attend college. If they don't, sometimes they feel like their lives are lost because now they're doomed to working in lower income jobs throughout their lives. In Great Britain, as to most of Europe, again, state-sponsored schools usually provide for education up to the level of minimum 16 and 18 if you want to, in the case of Great Britain, and then you can go to college. So college admission in the UK is based on exam scores, similar to the Japanese system, but it's not quite an all or nothing thing, since people who can't get into maybe the first university of their choice can usually get into another university, especially given the expansion of universities in recent decades. In the United States, in the past, the emphasis was on creating a small number of universities, and then during the 60s and 70s, the number of universities expanded, and they developed what they call community colleges, so that students could go to a local college. Even if they didn't do well in high school, they can go into a local college, and usually admission is inexpensive and also pretty much guaranteed as long as they're still breathing. And then they can work hard and get into a college of their choice in a kind of a second opportunity. So the function of the system of education, of course, there's a variety of different functions. One is it's one of the agents of socialization. So in primary school, you learn basic language and mathematical skills. In a certain sense, you're being socialized to the modern workplace, where you're expected to be able to read and write and do basic sums. Usually, this also includes cultural values and norms, such as obedience, respecting authority, and things of that nature, understanding and conforming to the hierarchy. So those things are part of the socialization process. Education also, of course, transmits culture, it transmits knowledge at different levels, and then through the college system particularly allows people to develop more highly skilled knowledge and even contribute to knowledge. Another vital function of the educational systems has always been social integration. So this has very often been a deliberate policy of governments to make sure that schools reinforce patriotism, such as, for example, the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of the day, or saluting the flag, learning about your country's history. So this could be seen as a form of propaganda, because everybody going to a particular school in a particular country is going to be taught that that country is a great country and has a great history. And of course, every country teaches this to their own students. So if you grow up in Mexico, you'll learn about how great Mexico is. You grow up in England, you'll learn all about English history and how wonderful it is. If you grow up in America, so on and so forth. Finally, social placement. So the educational system ultimately is going to end up placing people. So that's one of the things it does, is to score people. You get high grades, and then you can go to a better college, get a better degree, and in the end get a better job. So that would seem to be a meritocratic system. You're giving people better opportunities based on their merits, their skills, which is all fine and good, and certainly would fit the functionalist logic of education. On the other hand, critical theorists argue that very often minorities or poor people are disadvantaged, so when they get to school, they're often looked down upon, or they do less well in school for various reasons, not having enough money, not being able to buy the good books, not being able to fit in, or meet the expectations of teachers. So these students are disadvantaged. So the school system, according to critical theorists, tends to reproduce the social structure, since it will give the middle class and upper middle class and wealthy people an added boost and make it look as though they earned it, whereas it will push down or make it more difficult for minorities and poorer people to succeed. So the functionalist approach, as I said, is very good. It looks at how schools help integrate society and bring people together, but it overlooks the fact that educational systems tend to be very unequal. Most educational systems around the world, no matter how they're designed, tend to reproduce the class structure in each generation, because if you're from a wealthier background or a more cultured background, you're going to be able to give your child more support in school. The school will fit more their culture, and they will succeed more than people coming from poorer or minority backgrounds. So it takes that privilege and it makes it look as though it's something that you've earned. And I'm not trying to take away anything from anybody, but if you're disadvantaged and you go to school and people look down on you, and then you're told you're a loser because it's up to you, then it makes it look as though the system that is oppressing you is not oppressing you. It's your own failure that causes all your problems. So in this way, they're saying that this educational system takes a structure of inequality and makes it look as it's the fault of the people on the bottom for not being able to compete. Another thing critical theorists look at is the relationship between schooling and social control. So again, as I said before, schools tend to reinforce the idea that we live in a great country. They tend to emphasize the positive aspects of the society around them. The textbooks don't talk about inequality, and they don't talk about how many people may suffer. Another aspect of that is, as pointed out by Goals and Gintis, the educational system itself only arose when industrial factory owners needed obedient, disciplined workers who would come to work and check in at a regular time. So all the features of education, prompting pushing punctuality, making sure that people get used to working according to a time clock, all of these fit the factory system, which is why education was never really applied when most people were living in the farms. Another aspect of this is standardized testing, which is used to be a big debate. I'm not sure if it's a big debate anymore, but the idea of standardized testing is that everybody has to be graded according to the same standard. And this, of course, overlooks vast differences in the different experiences people have in their own lives based on their race or their ethnicity or class. Typically, the standardized test is going to favor the dominant group because they're the ones writing the test. They're the ones to whom the test makes sense, and they're the ones deciding who should succeed and who shouldn't succeed. So they're going to write questions that favor their culture. A part of this process is what we call tracking in schools. That is assigning students to different types of educational programs. So some students are tracked into high-achieving groups. Other students are tracked into low-achieving groups. And this has been going on for a long time. When I was a child, they did it by schools. So if you passed a certain exam at the age of 11, this was in England, you would go to a school that prepared you for college, basically. They called it a grammar school. If you didn't pass it, you'd be sent to what they called a comprehensive school that would prepare you for a life of flipping hamburgers or working in a factory. So basically, at the age of 11, your life would be determined. And of course, you could say, well, who knows at the age of 11 what they're ready for in life? Some people may mature later than other people. But very often it was the disadvantaged people from poorer minority communities who would fail these exams and then be tracked into the lower order, even though the exam itself may have had nothing to do with how successful they might be in later life. Other types of inequality may exist between public and private schools. If your parents are wealthy enough, they can send you to a private school. And of course, even public schools are not all the same. Some areas, particularly in inner cities, have public schools that are falling apart, where teachers don't want to work, and where you have maybe crime and other problems going on. Other public schools are in suburbs or wealthy areas where they don't have any of these problems, and they have lots of money for intramural programs and other things to stimulate the young minds of the students. Of course, a critical analysis of social conflict theory would point out that it obviously tends to minimize the extent to which schooling does provide an opportunity for social mobility for talented men and women from all backgrounds, and particularly with the advent of community colleges and other opportunities where people can go back to college. Even fairly old people can go back to college and learn new skills or get new degrees. And of course, keep in mind that once you get to college, you'll probably find that your curriculum, including your sociology courses, does tend to challenge social inequality on many levels. Still today, money is the biggest problem in terms of getting a higher education, and family income is still basically the best predictor for college attendance. Those who go to college tend to be from better off families. Now, for a period, they tried to change this by providing financial aid for poorer people, and that does still happen to a certain extent. So, for example, in the U.S., the federal government has a number of grants, states have grants, or schools will discount their tuition for lower income families. However, this has declined in recent years, frankly. And at the same time, the cost of education has skyrocketed. So, for example, when I went to college in the early 1980s, the tuition was $800 a year at UC Berkeley, which is one of the best public universities in the country. Now, the tuition at the same university is $12,000 to $15,000 a year for the same category that I was in. So the financial aid I got covered all my education and gave me extra money for my living expenses. Now, the same grants don't even cover even part of your tuition. So people end up having to go into debt, apply for a lot of loans, and this then creates another feature, which is that you're pushed to go into fields where you could earn back that money, which may seem like a good idea in the first place, but it means that other fields which are less lucrative, like teaching, the social sciences, the humanities, which are important fields, we need people in those fields, but people can't afford to study them because they'll never earn back the money needed to pay for their education. Now, some compensation for this, as I talked about before, in the U.S. we have community colleges, and this is becoming more common in other areas as well. Because they're local, they can be cheaper, they are more subsidized, they have low tuition, and this has provided a way for poorer people and minorities particularly to get into the educational system and work their way back in. So in that sense, there are some positive aspects. Obviously, the same problems that exist in society are going to exist in schools. So to the extent that crime and drugs and other issues have become a problem in society, these become a problem in schools. And some people believe that the schools have to crack down and teach students discipline, which to some extent has always been true, but even more so now. So you have schools in some inner cities where you have barred gates to get in, and they feel a bit more like prisons than schools. So this is not very motivating for students to go to a school where you have to go through barred gates and there are bars on all the windows. And of course, the crime may mean you may be a victim of assault. Some children may bring weapons. So in other words, social problems are spilling into the schools, and there's a big debate about what to do with that. So one option is to put up bars, put up barriers, put police officers in the school, and then you have an environment which is more like, as I said, a prison than an educational institution. However, we do have to keep children safe, as well as the teachers, of course, right? So there is a big problem with that regard. Another issue is passivity. Many students, of course, go to school, they just sit there, they're bored, they're not motivated by their classes, so that then creates a negative feedback. And again, this will often depend on how much those schools are able to pay their teachers. Sometimes what you get is a phenomenon where the best teachers will go to the private schools or to better paying public schools, and again, you get stuck with poor and minority areas having teachers who are not necessarily the best. I'm not going to disparage teachers in any place, but they all have a tough job. But it's a lot easier to be creative and to do stimulating things in your classroom when you have a budget and when you have a smaller classroom size and when you have extra time and maybe even money for training and for preparation. But if you're teaching 35 students in a classroom 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, it's going to be very hard to come up with that type of creativity and to really try to stimulate your students. So again, this is a problem. And the solution has very often been to make classroom sizes bigger and basically to warehouse students and not educate them. One of the results of this, of course, is the dropout rate. Students who drop out of school before finishing their final level of education. And in some ways, this is getting a little better. But again, typically you see for poorer communities and minority communities that you have higher dropout rates because these students see less relevance in the educational system for them. And it may also be because they feel compelled to start work at an earlier age. Some reasons for dropping out, for example, problems with English. And that doesn't just mean for immigrants, it also means for people, people who grew up in America or another English-speaking country, but didn't learn properly in grade school and they get passed along, and then by high school, they're simply unable to compete or understand what they're supposed to do, so school is just a blur. It doesn't really make any sense to them. Pregnancy or having to work to support the family is another factor in terms of why people drop out. Academic standards have dropped. I mean, this is a fact of life. As I mentioned in the last slide, there is a big problem with students being pushed through the system without actually learning the material. So it used to be, or at least in theory still is, in America, for example, that if you fail third grade, you'll be held back and have to repeat it. But there's a lot of pressure on teachers to push students through. So a lot of students get pushed through and they never actually learn how to read or write, or they never learn basic arithmetic. So the more they get pushed through, the more disadvantaged and the more disillusioned they become. And one sign perhaps that our system is not working the way it should is we spend a lot of money on education in this country, or at least in America, but we still have fairly low scores or skill levels in things like science and math. I would also say reading and writing is a bit of a problem too. And U.S. students are generally less motivated. They don't do very much homework. Particularly when you compare them to people from Japan or China, where there's a lot of pressure on students to study. They usually go to school, and then they'll very often go to an afternoon or after-school prep program to bone up for their exams. Also, the number of days in school. Japanese students spend 60 more days in school every year than U.S. students. So again, you say, how are our students supposed to compete with their students when they have 60 more days in school, plus they go into after-school programs to bone up for the exams? Whereas American students perhaps go to school, come home, and start playing video games. Now, there has been some changes in the way schools are operated. It used to be whatever neighborhood you were in, you just went to the local school, unless you were wealthy and could afford a private school. Now there's a lot of pressure for school choice, which means having different types of schools and allowing parents and children to choose the one they want to go to. So sometimes these are called magnet schools. So a magnet school is a school that specializes in a particular topic. So you could have a technology school or a business magnet school. When I was in high school, frankly, I went to an arts magnet school. I wasn't very artistic, but it was a lot more fun than the regular school. At least I thought so. Charter schools also are kind of an alternative to public schools. These are schools that are run like a private school, but use public funding. So a parent who wants to send their child to the charter school will get a voucher from the public school system, and that then goes to the charter school. And there's been some debate about whether parents should be able to use that voucher to send their kids to private schools as well. And there are some private schools running schools for the public system, so private non-profit. And there's a lot of debate about that, particularly with teachers' unions, because of course teachers feel this is a way to get around the unions by opening up charter schools or private schools where the school will not pay the same level that the public school is required to pay for the teachers. So there's a big debate about that. Some people would say, well, teachers are overpaid. I have to admit that's a very hard argument to make in the United States when you look at teacher salaries, and very often school unions are the only thing that give teachers a little extra income and a little extra professionalism. But again, that's a debate for another day. Homeschooling is another thing gaining popularity. So some parents, they don't want to send their kids to school because they're afraid of crime, or they're afraid of what they might do there. Sometimes it might be for religious reasons. Sometimes it might be just because the parents feel they can do a better job themselves. So there are a lot more children involved now in homeschooling. And again, another positive is, of course, people who live in very isolated areas. Sometimes they can get better results, but the downside is usually it's the more affluent or articulate parents who are able to do this, and that takes them out of the system. Another argument against it is it allows many religious groups to take their children out of the system, and therefore reinforces an insularity. They become insular and the children no longer have as much contact. So there may be some negative sides in terms of children's sociability or ability to socialize with other children, which involves many of the things that happen in school outside education, but things like peer groups and competing with others, and sometimes having their head knocked in a little bit. Another big problem is segregation. We just talked in the last section about the civil rights movement a little bit. We'll talk about it again. And one fundamental goal of the civil rights movement was to desegregate schools, where you had systems where particularly African American students would be pushed into separate schools, typically with lower funding and lower budgets. Now that ended, you can no longer have official segregation, but there's still a lot of segregation. It's usually based on where people live. So as whites and wealthier people have moved to suburbs, they have better schools, better funded schools, and many people stuck in the inner cities who are typically, again, the poor and minorities, are still going to the older, dilapidated schools with many more problems. So we are seeing that almost as many people, or maybe even just as many people, are going to schools which are almost exclusively white or black. And the ideal of having fully integrated school systems is not succeeding. Anyway, I hope you liked this discussion about education. And obviously, it's only a quick discussion, and if you're interested in more, there's a lot more research and study that can be done. Have a good day, and I'll see you later. Bye.